What if the warnings written thousands of years ago were never symbolic, but literal, and already beginning to unfold beneath the Euphrates River? For generations, the Euphrates has stood at the center of some of the most mysterious prophetic passages ever recorded, a river repeatedly described as the place where powerful beings were bound until an appointed time. Today, as its waters retreat at an unprecedented pace, newly exposed chambers, unexplained tremors, and strange discoveries are raising questions that many once believed belonged only to ancient texts. Could these events be coincidences, or could they signal something far more significant, something that suggests the timeline of prophecy is quietly moving forward? Before we uncover what was reportedly found beneath the river, make sure to like this video, subscribe for future updates, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because what comes next may challenge everything we thought we knew. The ancient world has long spoken in whispers about rivers that do more than carry water, rivers that mark boundaries between seasons, kingdoms, and even the unseen realms. Among them, the Euphrates stands apart, named not only in the chronicles of early civilization, but also in the solemn language of prophecy. For generations, many read those passages as distant warnings meant for another age, another people, another time. Yet today, as the river slowly withdraws from its banks, exposing stone long hidden beneath its currents, a quiet question rises in the hearts of those who watch. Are we witnessing the unfolding of something once sealed? Scripture speaks with unmistakable clarity. In the book of Revelation it is written, "Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." And the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year were released. Revelation 9:14-15. These words were never presented as poetry alone, but as a declaration that history itself moves according to an appointed time. Like a watchman standing upon the walls, the believer is called not to fear the night, but to remain awake and discerning. For the signs of great turning points rarely arrive with the sound of trumpets. At first, they begin quietly, in the shifting of waters, in the trembling of the ground, in discoveries that seem small until their meaning is understood. And so the question before this generation is not merely what has been uncovered beneath the river, but whether humanity is prepared to recognize the hour when it comes. For as the pastor reminds his congregation, when prophecy begins to move from page to landscape, wisdom is not found in panic, but in readiness of the heart. And it was not long after these words began to circulate again among believers and scholars that subtle changes along the banks of the Euphrates started drawing attention, changes that, at first, seemed insignificant, yet would soon prove impossible to ignore. At first, the changes seemed small. Too small for global headlines, too subtle for immediate alarm. But along several remote stretches of the Euphrates, locals began reporting something unusual. The river was not simply lowering, it was pulling back unevenly, revealing long, dark formations beneath the surface that had never appeared in living memory. Fishermen spoke of newly exposed stone ridges that looked less like natural rock and more like walls, buried under centuries of water, running in straight lines, where nature rarely draws them. Then came the tremors, short, rhythmic vibrations felt beneath the ground, not strong enough to be earthquakes, yet too precise to feel random. Instruments registered them. People felt them in their homes. And strangely, the pulses often appeared at the same hours each night, as if something deep below the earth were moving in measured intervals. What truly unsettled observers, however, was what followed the tremors. Restricted zones suddenly appeared along parts of the riverbank. Military vehicles arrived without explanation. Drone patrols circled above areas where civilians had once walked freely. No official statements described what was being monitored, and no scientific teams publicly announced excavations. Yet satellite images hinted at increased activity, where the river had most dramatically receded. The silence itself began to feel louder than any announcement could have been. Rumors spread quickly. Newly opened fissures, strange metallic readings detected beneath the soil, and reports never confirmed, yet never fully denied, of large underground cavities uncovered where the riverbed had withdrawn. For some, these were ordinary geological shifts. For others, especially those familiar with ancient prophecies tied to this very river, the developments felt far less ordinary. Because when water retreats and hidden ground begins to show, history teaches a simple lesson: what rises next is rarely expected. But what began as quiet environmental changes soon led to something far more unsettling: discoveries that suggested the ground beneath the river was not merely shifting, but opening. Under the cover of night, when most activity along the restricted zones had slowed and surveillance patterns briefly widened, a small independent research team moved toward one of the newly exposed sections of the riverbank. Their intention was simple: document geological formations before erosion or military sealing made them inaccessible. What they found instead was something none of their instruments had predicted. A jagged fissure had split open along a stretch of dark stone, but the deeper they examined it, the less natural it appeared. The interior edges were unusually smooth, angled with a precision that suggested design rather than fracture. When their lights shone deeper into the opening, the beam revealed descending stone walls that reflected light with a faint, polished sheen far too refined for a structure shaped by water pressure or shifting sediment alone. The entrance did not resemble a collapsed cave. It looked, unsettlingly, like a passage. And said. As they stepped inside, environmental readings began to fluctuate. Temperature dropped sharply, yet the air felt heavy and strangely warm at the same time, pressing against their lungs in a way none of them could immediately explain. Metallic traces appeared on their scanners, though no visible ore veins lined the walls. Then came the first detail that caused the team to stop speaking entirely. Under ultraviolet light, faint markings began to glow across the stone-thin lines at first, then entire clusters of symbols stretching along the corridor like constellations carved into the earth itself. What the markings meant was still unknown, but one realization settled over the group almost immediately. This place had not been formed by chance. It had been constructed or sealed for a purpose, and whatever that purpose was, it had remained hidden for far longer than anyone standing there had expected. Transition from paragraph 3 to paragraph 4. As the team moved deeper into the passage, the glowing symbols became clearer, and with them came the first unmistakable sign that this place was never meant to be entered. Paragraph 4 is approximately equal to 300 words. When the ultraviolet beam swept across the walls for a second time, what had first appeared as scattered markings revealed itself as something far more deliberate. Rows of inscriptions stretched across the stone in repeating sequences, each cluster framed by geometric patterns that seemed designed to guide the eye toward a central line of text. Though many of the scripts belonged to different eras and languages, some resembling early Mesopotamian forms, others echoing later ancient alphabets, the message they conveyed appeared strikingly consistent. Across multiple translations, the same warning emerged: "Do not open. The bound ones await the appointed hour." The realization unsettled the group more than the darkness surrounding them. Warnings in a single language might suggest ritual markings or local legend, but inscriptions repeated across multiple ancient tongues hinted at something far older, something preserved, translated, and deliberately reinforced over generations. It suggested that whoever created this passage expected it to be found eventually, and wanted the warning understood regardless of who arrived. As the team advanced, their instruments began registering subtle, rhythmic vibrations beneath the floor. The pulses were faint yet remarkably steady, repeating at intervals that resembled a slow heartbeat rather than the irregular shifts of geological movement. With each step downward, the air cooled further, thin frost forming along the edges of the stone, while an inexplicable warmth lingered just beneath the surface of the walls, as though energy still flowed through the structure itself. The corridor no longer felt abandoned. It felt dormant, like a mechanism waiting, silent but intact, for the moment something would finally trigger its next movement. Following the pulsing vibrations deeper into the structure, the corridor finally opened into a chamber that none of them were prepared to see. The narrow descent ended abruptly, spilling the team into a vast circular chamber whose scale defied the dimensions of the passage that led to it. Their lights struggled to reach the far edges of the domed ceiling, yet even in partial darkness the architecture appeared unnaturally precise. No collapsed stone, no erosion, no irregular fractures that would normally mark ancient underground caverns. The chamber seemed less carved than formed, as though the surrounding rock had once been shaped under immense pressure into a single, deliberate design. At the exact center of the floor lay the first unmistakable anomaly. 4 enormous metal chains, extended outward from evenly spaced anchor points embedded deep within the stone, each link thicker than a human torso and coated in a dark metallic sheen that reflected light in faint iridescent tones. Despite the apparent age of the structure, the metal showed no corrosion, no dust accumulation, and no visible sign of decay. It looked intact, recently intact. One member of the team cautiously approached the nearest anchor, directing a handheld thermal scanner toward the chain. The readings fluctuated unpredictably, shifting between cold and warm in rapid intervals, as though the material itself resisted settling into a stable temperature. The discovery alone would have been unsettling, but what drew the group into complete silence was not the presence of the chains, it was their condition. Every restraint was open. No fractured links lay scattered across the floor. No broken anchors suggested mechanical failure. The chains had not rusted away, nor had they snapped under pressure. They hung outward, empty and still, leaving only one possibility echoing in the minds of those standing in the chamber. Whatever had once been held, there was no longer present. And it was only when the team began scanning the floor around the anchors that the true meaning of the empty chains became impossible to ignore. At first, the markings on the stone floor seemed like irregular depressions, shadows created by uneven light, or the natural shifting of the chamber over time. But as the researchers adjusted their lamps and stepped closer, the shapes sharpened into something unmistakable. Imprinted deep within the dust-covered stone were a series of massive footprints, each impression far larger than any human step, and spaced at intervals that suggested a stride far beyond normal proportions. The edges were sharply defined, not worn down by centuries of erosion, indicating that whatever had left them had done so relatively recently. Following the direction of the prints, the team noticed additional signs that the chamber had not remained undisturbed. Hairline fractures spread outward from each of the 4 anchor points, thin cracks branching across the floor and climbing the walls like frozen lightning. These were not the slow, irregular breaks produced by geological pressure. They radiated with a force that appeared sudden and concentrated, as though immense strain had been applied in a single violent moment. Along several sections of the stone pillars, deep gouges cut straight through the rock, each groove running parallel to the next, in patterns that resembled claw marks driven with overwhelming strength. A faint metallic odor lingered in the air, mixed with a sharper scent reminiscent of sulfur, causing several instruments to flicker with interference as readings fluctuated without clear cause. Compasses failed to hold direction, and electromagnetic sensors registered brief surges that faded as quickly as they appeared. The chamber no longer felt abandoned. Every detail suggested that the structure had not simply aged into ruin, it had been disturbed forcefully, recently, and whatever had once been restrained within it had not quietly disappeared. Yet the most unsettling discovery was not found among the shattered anchors or the deep impressions on the floor. It waited in a narrow alcove along the chamber wall that, strangely, remained untouched. While much of the chamber bore the unmistakable signs of violent disturbance, a recessed alcove carved into the far wall appeared almost perfectly preserved. No fractures ran across its surface, no dust clouds marked recent impact, and the stone surrounding it carried a faint, unusual warmth that contrasted with the cold air filling the rest of the chamber. As one of the researchers directed a focused beam of light into the recess, the outline of a rectangular object slowly emerged from beneath layers of hardened sediment. Carefully brushing away the surrounding debris, revealed a clay tablet embedded deep within the stone, its surface remarkably intact, despite what appeared to be centuries of concealment. The inscriptions etched across the tablet were unusually deep, each line cut with such force that the grooves looked less carved than burned into the material. Portions of the clay near the edges showed darkened discoloration, as though exposed to intense heat at some point, yet the central text remained clear and sharply defined. When scanned under enhanced lighting, the markings revealed patterns consistent with extremely early script forms, arranged in deliberate rows that appeared designed to be read sequentially. Initial translations suggested a structured message rather than a simple inscription, phrases referencing trembling ground, the breaking of restraints, and the approach of a specific appointed moment. Nearby, partially hidden beneath fallen fragments of stone, the team uncovered a smaller shard that seemed to belong to the same artifact. Unlike the longer text on the primary tablet, this fragment carried only a short, stark line of writing. Though incomplete, the surviving words were unmistakable. They rise, not alone. The discovery introduced a new and unsettling implication that the chamber had not held a single presence, nor even a single group, but something connected to a far wider network still hidden beyond the limits of the excavation. What the team did not yet realize was that the chamber's discoveries were only the beginning, because even as they documented the tablet, instruments outside the structure had already begun, recording changes spreading far beyond the cave itself. Within hours of the initial exploration, monitoring equipment positioned along the nearby riverbanks began registering a series of unusual seismic signatures. These were not the chaotic spikes associated with natural earthquakes, nor the random tremors caused by shifting sediment. Instead, the signals appeared in repeating intervals, steady, rhythmic pulses traveling through underground fault lines in multiple directions at once. When analysts mapped the movement patterns, the results revealed something difficult to dismiss. The vibrations were not radiating outward from a single epicenter, but advancing along parallel pathways, as though several distinct sources were moving beneath the surface simultaneously. Thermal imaging drones deployed during the same period captured additional anomalies along remote stretches of the river valley. In several frames, elongated shapes appeared briefly against the cooler nighttime terrain, each form registering at temperatures slightly below the surrounding environment before fading from view. The recordings were inconclusive, distorted by interference and atmospheric fluctuations, but consistent enough to attract the attention of research teams monitoring the region. Local residents soon reported their own unsettling observations. Animals that normally gathered near the river began avoiding certain areas entirely, leaving previously active watering points unusually silent. Livestock refused to approach the shoreline, and flocks of birds altered their flight paths in wide arcs that bypassed specific sections of land. While each of these changes could be explained individually through environmental factors, their timing occurring almost immediately after the underground chamber's discovery formed a pattern that many observers found increasingly difficult to ignore. Something beneath the valley appeared to be moving, and whatever it was, the surrounding ecosystem seemed to sense its presence long before anyone else could confirm it. As the unusual signals continued to ripple across the valley, researchers began to realize that the chamber they had entered was not the conclusion of the mystery, it was the point where the larger pattern began. In the days following the discovery, investigators reviewing the collected data noticed that none of the findings stood alone. The empty restraints inside the chamber, the deep fractures radiating from the anchor points, the massive footprints impressed into stone, and the ancient tablet describing the breaking of bonds all formed a sequence that appeared disturbingly coherent. Each element pointed toward the same possibility. The underground structure had not merely been ceremonial or symbolic in nature. It had functioned as a containment site, engineered to hold something of extraordinary scale and strength. The fact that the chains remained intact while the surrounding stone showed signs of sudden stress suggested that whatever had once been restrained there had not escaped through gradual deterioration. The release, if that is what it was, had occurred with force strong enough to leave structural shock patterns still visible long after the event. Beyond the chamber itself, monitoring teams began mapping subtle environmental changes spreading outward from the region. Seismic sensors recorded faint but persistent vibrations traveling through underground fault lines, not in chaotic bursts but in repeating intervals that hinted at coordinated movement beneath the surface. Soil displacement patterns detected by satellite imagery revealed narrow stretches of terrain that appeared slightly lifted or newly unsettled, despite no visible landslides or excavation activity. In several remote sections of the valley, riverbank sediment had shifted in thin, linear formations, as though pressure from below had momentarily pushed upward before settling again. None of these movements reached levels that would normally trigger public alerts, yet their timing occurring within the same period as the chamber's exposure made them difficult for analysts to dismiss entirely. Local reports added another layer of unease. Farmers spoke of livestock refusing to approach certain watering areas that had previously been used without hesitation. Wildlife migration paths altered in small but noticeable ways, bypassing sections of the valley that had long served as natural corridors. Even electronic monitoring equipment occasionally registered brief interference spikes that disappeared before engineers could isolate their source. Individually, each of these incidents could be explained through ordinary environmental fluctuations. Together, however, they suggested that the region was experiencing a subtle but measurable shift, one whose origin had yet to be fully understood. For historians and theologians who have long studied the symbolic role of the Euphrates in ancient texts, the developments carried an additional dimension. The river has appeared repeatedly in prophetic literature as a geographical marker tied to moments of transition times when hidden forces were believed to move from concealment into open influence. Whether one views these references as spiritual allegory or historical metaphor, the coincidence of the river's rapid retreat and the sudden exposure of previously submerged structures has drawn renewed global attention to the area. The central question remains unresolved. Are these discoveries simply the natural consequences of environmental change, or are they revealing remnants of a forgotten chapter of human or perhaps pre-human history only now coming to light? As more surveys continue and additional sections of the riverbed are examined, researchers expect further findings to emerge, each piece contributing to a clearer understanding of what once existed beneath the flowing waters of the Euphrates. Until then, the story remains unfinished, suspended between explanation and speculation, waiting for the next discovery to determine which direction it will ultimately take. If you want to continue following the latest updates, make sure to like this video, subscribe for future investigations, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because what is uncovered next may reshape how this entire discovery is understood.